Well, I think to understand inclusive communities, it is good to start with the concept of inclusive growth that many of us are familiar with, right? If you look at different societies, well, United Nations, OECD, and of course Singapore government as well, we are talking about inclusive growth. And by that, we mean that the society is going to be economically vibrant. There will be fruits of economic growth, and you want to make sure that these fruits, this growth, are being shared with the people who are of a lower income, who might actually miss out some of this growth because of structural adjustment and so on. Now, when you think about inclusive growth in that sense, then the notion of inclusive society or inclusive communities make a lot of sense. It means that as a society progresses, as you get good communities involvement, as social issues and behavioral and technology issues come together, where big data bring wonders to society and so on, are we actually also making sure that there are people of different strata, especially those on the lower strata, or perhaps there are different groups that are also included in part of this societal progress to make sure that they are not left out? Now, the trick is, what are these groups of people? Now, unlike inclusive growth, which is pretty easy for inclusive growth, it is the lower income people who kind of like may miss out on good jobs and so on. In inclusive societies or inclusive communities, it is not so clear which are these groups that need to be included. First, therefore, I would say to plan for inclusive communities, you need to make sure that you identify the correct groups. Now that sounds like a strange question, like, well, a strange answer, like what do you need to identify them? Surely these are the groups. Well, if we ask who are which groups, you'll find that in the same room, I ask you to raise your hands, you may not actually get an agreement. Now those that we can agree, actually, like in the context of Singapore, it will be like race, religion, make sure that all the races are involved, religions are involved. That's because we grew up with that narrative in Singapore. Now, of course, now we know that we better also involve the lower income who might miss out, maybe socially excluded due to the lack of a mobile phone, a smartphone, and therefore, if you have anything to do with things that you require a mobile phone in order to socially interact, then these groups will be left out. So you need to make sure they are included. There's another group that we are very familiar with, that is people with physical disabilities. And because we want to make sure you have ramps, you want to make sure you plan your housing, your lift, your community public spaces in areas that they can all come together and interact. They can move from place to place very conveniently, so that there's mobility for them. You want to connect and have wonderful train systems. You want to have high-speed rails and all. Then you want to make sure that our people with disabilities are also included, so that they are not being left out. As things move faster, wonders, and get connected, they actually are not left behind. But what about people with mental disabilities or mental conditions? As we get older, many of us will actually, including you and I, will actually get dementia, for example. We'll forget things. And then do we have a community that can cater for that? And that may sound strange, but actually there are already initiatives in Singapore where you ensure that you build communities, factoring into your planning that actually people get older, sometimes you do forget things. And how can you arrange a system, both physically and socially, where these people are taken care of? Then the list can go on and on, right? Whether you have people who are not just elderly, not just disabled, but what about people who are singles? Why should we include people who are singles? Well, because as we get older, actually, if you look at our fertility rates and look at our marriage rates, there will be actually a large proportion of people, both citizens and foreigners, who are actually going to be single up to when they are pretty old. Then you want to make sure that as you plan your city, as you plan your society, when you want to have very good family-friendly programs, you must not ignore the people who are single, who do not have your traditional family makeup and so on. So how then do we involve these people, include them in a way, so that as your society progresses, they not only feel that they are not excluded, they are very much part of it, and they can contribute, and they can volunteer, and they actually can also enjoy the fruits of the societal progress, just like economically how inclusive growth will work. Whether you are a city planner, like a city governor in many cities, right, you need to plan your structure and you plan your city, how the physical arrangements. And if you are a policy maker, or if you're the government, like in the context of Singapore, where your city equals your country and your country equals your city, you need to actually marry the two together, which sometimes is a challenge. I think the important concept of all these, actually with all these security threats that we all now face, we know that things are actually quite not only troubling, but challenging for planners. Because it is no longer your traditional security threats, for example, where you think about natural disasters and physical threats like the terrorism, where people bring in huge bombs and guns. You can actually attack people now through knives and through vehicles and all, which means that the idea of things happening, it is actually a foregone conclusion. Right? Sooner or later, in any city, including Singapore, there will be a terrorist act because they can be committed in a way that no one can actually prevent them. And these will be committed in public spaces where there are most people, which means that the first officers at scene will take some time to come. Right? They will never be able to prevent fully, and the first people at scene will be actually you and I, members of the public, and so on. It then raises a lot of issues for city planners and policymakers. Right? It means that things are going to happen. So you cannot just talk about prevention, you have to talk about preventing it, you have to talk about responding to it, and you have to talk about the recovery process. So in your city planning or in planning a society, you need to make sure that the idea of prevention, the idea of good responses, and the idea of recovery is all seamlessly tied together. And how then you tie that together with your physical planning and your social planning of your society becomes very important. Now relate back to your question, which is about resilience and trust. Resilience, why? Because resilience really means that when something bad happens, and it's going to happen, and it has happened, and can you then bounce back? And as I said, it's going to happen. And therefore, we need to focus on the response and recovery and not just prevention, because no matter how you prevent, and you must prevent, things are going to happen. But in order for the resilience to work, or even for the prevention or response to work, actually you need a lot of trust. You need a lot of trust, because in times of uncertainty and crisis, we actually are emotionally reactive, right? You take flight, or you take flight, or you fight. And you need to look up to people, and you need people to give you instructions and so on. And we all know that instinctually, you will listen to people whom you trust. You will listen most to the people whom you trust most. And if we don't trust our police officers, our public officers, if we don't trust the information that they give out are true and correct and honest, then we will have a problem. We have a problem because then there will be fake news all over. People will give you different kinds of views, and you begin to actually not so-called follow the right instructions. And these right instructions, I don't mean politically correct, I mean good instructions that will save lives. So when times of disaster and uncertainty, social resilience therefore is critical. But for resilience to work, it cannot just build trust overnight. You need to build up your public trust very early on. And public trust, we don't refer to just trust in politicians. That, of course, is important and, in fact, quite paramount. It is about trust in the public officials, trust in your police officers, trust in the civil defense people, and so on. It goes both ways. Make sure our public officers are competent and have the integrity and the character. And then the trust then can be earned, because the trust cannot be demanded. As I have said, right, in order to be inclusive, you really need to first identify those groups. And by inclusive, it's not just about identifying and then make sure you're included, because what does inclusion mean? If you think about it, inclusion really means that, number one, ensure that I am aware of you and you are aware of me and you are part of us. Second, it means that actually there's no discrimination. It means that I ensure that you're treated equally like everybody else who are already part of it. We're already included, and now I'm including you. I want to make sure that you are part of us, and therefore you are treated equally. Now, you and I may not be the same. In fact, we will not be the same. We will be diverse. We will be different. And precisely, inclusion is not about sameness or similarity even, right? Inclusion is precisely about differences and diversity. And the question is that despite, and in fact, because you are different, and we are therefore diverse, we are not homogeneous, it is very important for us to realize that we need to come together. Then there will be commonalities and there will be complementarity in our differences. Now, how do we ensure that we are aware of these groups? As I have said, many groups are obvious: race, religion, even elderly, people with physical disabilities. What we are not very good at is to be cognizant and identify those groups, such as people with mental conditions, people who are of lower income, and so on. And we need to plan for them quite early, because some of these things, once it takes roots and it gets stereotyped, it is very, very difficult to talk about inclusion, not to mention to even implement the inclusion. Let me give you a very quick example, right? Think about social income groups. Right? For many years, many of us who are social and behavioral scientists have publicly cautioned that we need to actually watch out for them. Because as we progress as a society, both economically and socially, in fact, your Gini coefficient will not be reduced, it will increase. Right? It will actually get larger and larger our income gap and our wealth gap. Why? Because there will be flow of talent and capital, and people will do well. And there's no limit to people doing well, but people will continue to not do well for some strata. And so your income gap and your wealth gap actually will always increase, in fact, in any progressive society, progressive in the sense of economically. Now, one way, of course, is to reduce the income gap, and we need to reduce it to some extent. But reducing the income gap is really not the solution. And let me explain why. Right? The best way, the easiest way to reduce the income gap is to make sure everybody is very poor. And if everybody is very poor, there is no income inequality. Now that everybody suffers, and that you don't want to do. It is not possible to make everybody very rich. We need to be practical, and it's not possible. Therefore, the question, the issue for me is not just keep reducing the income gap, because that might not be the practical, feasible, that might not even be the issue. The issue we want to ask is, what is the social inequality that is affecting the society's cohesion and its economic progress, right? Affecting its fabric. And the answer to that is actually the lack of social mobility. And the answer to that is actually that the inequality is not just inequality, it's translating into social fissures, social friction. Now, when you realize that that is really the issue, is social fissures, social friction, as well as inequalities affecting cohesion, then you need to address the root of the issue. Now, if I were to be the policy maker or the community leader, what I'll try to do is to ensure cohesion. There are many ways to do it, and one quick example is that think about the Singapore's context, where everybody knows what tuition is all about, right? Because despite the fact that we have very good schools and we don't actually, in some sense, need tuition, we have tuition all over the place. Now, if we can get rid of tuition, I think that's quite good. But at the same time, we forgot that there are people from the lower income households who are actually not doing very well, not coping very well in school. And those people, those students, actually do need tuition. Not tuition to get wonderful A's and all, but tuition to make sure that they get the basics and they don't lose out. But they do not have the means for those tuition, right? Because tuition is expensive and tuition takes time. And you can't just tuition from the parents, because sometimes the parents themselves may not have the educational qualifications to do that. What do we do? Well, one way to deal with that is to ensure to have programs whereby your students from middle and higher income households actually give the tuition. So these students now start giving tuition to those students from lower income. Now, what does this accomplish? Number one, it brings people together. It reduces your notion of elitism, because people from the higher and well-off now begin to experience, and when you help others, you begin to realize that not only you feel happy, you become more grateful of your situation, you begin to give back to society. It actually benefits the helper and not just those who are being helped. Of course, it benefits those who are being helped. And then you get cohesion. You continue to have that social inequality, but then you will have cohesion. Take that tuition example, expand it, elaborate it on other policies that we have to deal with. So the issue then sometimes is not just to reduce differences. In fact, live and understand the differences, realize what are the causes of the problems, and then address those problems and the issue of it. And as you do so, you will realize that you're not just preventing problems, you are also promoting and aspiring to better things such as building cohesion and so on. And in this example that I gave, you help not those who are being helped, you also help the helper themselves. Social media is always one of the most interesting, most difficult, and most challenging issue to deal with, right? It's almost like no matter what you say, you will never be right. And you're always afraid that you get bashed up in social media, whatever you say, right? And so what happened? And that's really the problem. What happened then is you begin to say things that you think social media like you to say. And the nature of social media, and strangely, I think particularly in Singapore, you find that people love to do and say anti-establishment things. Now, even among people who are pro-establishment, you will notice actually if you check all your WhatsApp, if that's ever possible, people actually enjoy gossiping and talking about anti-establishment things, right? Well, we can go into the social, psychological reasons for that, but I won't go into that. I think what I want to say is that you need to realize that all of us now actually have dual identities. Right? We have an identity in the real world. There's a David Chan in the real world. There's a David Chan in social media, a David Chan in WhatsApp. And there's a you also in the real world and a you in your virtual world. And this is not hypocrisy. Right? This is the nature of things. We all actually now function in dual worlds. And these two worlds, no matter you talk about AI, artificial intelligence or what, actually is unlikely to be fully integrated where it become one and the same, right? And that is because we just simply behave differently when we are face-to-face interacting with people, and when we are not face-to-face, when we are on social media and so on. So we need to live with the fact that there are two worlds, understand that they sometimes operate differently. You may want to have a policy that says that, well, you know, defamation is defamation. It doesn't matter whether you're in the social world or you're in the physical world. And to some extent, we agree, because my reputation is to be damaged, and then of course I'm going to sue you if you're saying things that are false of me. And it doesn't matter you say it in the social world or in the real world. But in other situations, you need to have to live with the fact that there are two realities. And when there are two realities, two kinds of rules, if you like, psychological rules operating, you need to adapt yourself to those rules, which means that in the case of social media, sometimes people say things which will be very different in the real world. You need to check the facts. You need to ask yourself of the source. You need to ask yourself, is the person joking? What is the context of the issue, and so on. Now, when you understand all this, then back to the question of social resilience, inclusivity, and so on, if social media becomes not a problem, social media becomes a wonderful enabler. It becomes a place where you can bring people together in ways where you can't do it in the real world. If I'm physically disabled, it is quite difficult for me to travel long distances to meet you. But with WhatsApp, social media, Facebook, and other technologies now, it is very possible. So then the social media can not only connect people who were socially excluded in the past, it can actually be also a start for people who were already included, or in people who were excluded and now included, to be able to interact and so on. And when you do that well, when you are able to minimize spreading of fake news, and even when they continue to spread, the consumer are more intelligent now, able to discern, then you will be able to be more socially resilient. In times of crisis and uncertainty, people can react quickly and so on. But you'll be competing for information, correct? Police officers or the police force will be giving out information on social media. The government, even the terrorists and people who are trying to influence you, it could be a group, it could be a person, an individual, or even a foreign country. And when that happens now, you have to be discerning, who do you trust? We go back then to the issue of public trust, which needs to be developed quickly and also over time, so that when things happen, you are able to prevent, people are able to discern, and social media becomes more of a strength and asset rather than a liability or a weakness.